House on Hemlock Hill, the old Victorians stood defiant against the encroaching woods, a skeletal silhouette against the moonless night. Locals called it the Hemlock House, a name whispered with equal parts dread and fascination. It had been vacant for decades, its windows dark, empty eyes staring into the soul of the forest. Curiosity, a dangerous mistress, had led me to its doorstep. Armed with a flashlight and a reckless disregard for common sense, I stepped over the crumbling threshold. The house was a labyrinth of shadows, the floorboards creaking protests with every step. Dust motes danced in the feeble beam of my flashlight, each one a specter in the gloom. A chill, unrelated to the autumn night, crept down my spine. The air was thick with an unseen presence, a weight that pressed down on my shoulders. A musty scent, like decaying leaves and old parchment, clung to the air. I pressed on, driven by a morbid compulsion. The upper floors were worse. Wallpaper peeled in grotesque patterns, revealing the house's skeletal frame. Shadows writhed and twisted, taking on grotesque shapes in the flickering light. A floorboard groaned under my weight, and a cold draft swept through the room, carrying with it a whisper, a mournful sigh that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Then I saw it. A door, ajar at the end of the hallway. A sliver of light escaped from beneath it. My heart pounded in my ears as I approached. With trembling hands, I pushed the door open. The room was a study. Bookshelves lined the walls, their contents spilling onto the floor. A desk stood in the center, covered in papers and strange symbols. But it was the figure in the armchair that froze my blood. An old man sat there, his skin pale and translucent, his eyes hollow black pits. His body was hunched, as if in eternal agony. A faint, ethereal glow surrounded him, casting eerie shadows on the walls. As I watched, his eyes seemed to open, focusing on me with a chilling intensity. A guttural growl escaped his lips, a sound that seemed to vibrate through my bones. Fear, primal and overwhelming, seized me. I turned and ran, my feet pounding on the creaking floorboards. Behind me, I heard a heavy footfall, a pursuit that gained speed with every passing second. The house seemed to shrink as I raced through it, each room a blur of shadows and darkness. I stumbled, fell, but picked myself up, driven by a terror that fueled my escape. Finally, I burst through the front door into the cold night air. The Hemlock House loomed behind me, its windows glowing with an unnatural light. I ran, without looking back, until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. I collapsed in the damp grass, gasping for breath. The woods around me seemed to close in, their shadows pressing down on me. I was alone, utterly and completely alone. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I was not alone in the darkness. Days turned into a blur of sleepless nights and haunted dreams. The Hemlock House had seeped into my consciousness, a malignant tumor of terror. In the quiet of my apartment, I'd hear the creak of old floorboards, the whisper of unseen breaths. Shadows danced on the walls, taking on grotesque shapes, their eyes burning into mine. I tried to ignore it, to bury the fear deep within. I threw myself into work, but the Hemlock House was always there, a specter lurking in the corners of my mind. I started to see him in the crowds, the old man with the hollow eyes, his spectral form drifting among the living. Then came the nightmares. I was back in the house, trapped in its suffocating embrace. The old man was closer, his breath hot on my neck. I would wake screaming, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding like a trapped bird. Desperate, I returned to the Hemlock House. It was daytime now, the sun casting harsh shadows through the grimy windows. I carried a camera, hoping to capture evidence, to prove that I wasn't losing my mind. The interior was even more desolate, in the cold light of day. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams, each one a mocking specter. I climbed the stairs, my heart pounding in my ears. The study was, as I remembered it, the armchair empty. A sense of anticlimax washed over me, then a creeping dread. A noise from upstairs made me freeze. Footsteps, soft and deliberate. I crept to the top of the stairs, my camera aimed at the hallway. A door at the end of the corridor stood ajar. A chill ran down my spine. With trembling hands, I pushed open the door. A small room, barely lit by a single dusty window. A child's room. A rocking horse stood in the corner, its paint chipped and faded. A dollhouse sat on a small table, its miniature inhabitants frozen in porcelain poses. And then I saw her, a little girl, sitting on the edge of the bed. Her skin was as pale as moonlight, her eyes as black as the void. She turned her head slowly, her gaze meeting mine. A smile spread across her face, a chilling, unnatural grin that revealed rows of tiny, perfect teeth. I raised the camera, but before I could take a picture, she was gone. The room was empty, save for the rocking horse and the dollhouse. A cold dread settled over me, a realization as chilling as the grave. The Hemlock House was not just haunted, It was a place of unspeakable evil, and it was reaching out to me. The house was no longer just a place. It was a living, malevolent entity. It called to me, a siren song of terror and fascination. I was trapped in its web, a moth drawn to a deadly flame. Days turned into nights, and nights into a blur of fear-induced insomnia. The house's presence was everywhere. I saw the old men in shadows, the little girl in fleeting glimpses. Their faces, once terrifying, now held a strange familiarity, as if they were part of me. The house began to change. Doors creaked open by themselves. Objects moved, and shadows took on more defined, menacing shapes. Whispers echoed through the rooms, carrying with them promises of unimaginable horrors. One night, I woke to a sound, a soft scratching at my window. Heart pounding, I crept to the glass. The moon cast an eerie glow, illuminating a figure outside. It was the little girl, her face pressed against the pane, her eyes burning with an unnatural intensity. Terror seized me. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. The window shattered, and she was inside, a silent specter in the night. Her eyes locked onto mine, and a cold dread washed over me. She moved towards me, slowly, deliberately. Each step was a death knell, a countdown to oblivion. I backed away, my legs trembling. The room seemed to shrink around me, the walls closing in. As she reached out to touch me, a blinding light filled the room. A scream tore from my throat as I was enveloped in a searing pain. When my vision cleared, the room was empty. The little girl was gone. I was alone, but something was different. A sense of peace washed over me, a calm that was both terrifying and liberating. I looked at my hands, and they were translucent, ethereal. I could see through them, as if I were a ghost. Fear turned to acceptance. This was my fate, to become a part of the house, a prisoner in its eternal torment. The Hemlock house had won. I was no longer a living soul, but a ghost trapped in a haunted mansion, doomed to wander its corridors for eternity. As dawn broke, casting its first rays of light into the room, I looked out the window. The world outside was bathed in a golden glow, a world of life and hope, and I was a part of it no longer. The Hemlock house stood silent, its secrets locked within its decaying walls. A new chapter had begun, a chapter of eternal darkness, where I, a prisoner of my own fear, would dwell for all eternity. The house stood at the end of a long, winding dirt road, a skeletal silhouette against the moonless night. Local legend claimed it was the work of a deranged architect, a man obsessed with darkness and despair. They said the house was built to trap shadows, to be a prison for nightmares. And now, it seemed, it was fulfilling its purpose. I'd come to the house out of morbid curiosity. The tales were too enticing to ignore. As I approached, a chill seeped into my bones, a cold that seemed to emanate from the house itself. The wind howled through the skeletal trees, a mournful dirge that sent shivers down my spine. With a deep breath, I stepped onto the porch. The wood groaned beneath my weight, as if protesting my intrusion. The front door, wrought iron and heavy, creaked open with a reluctant sigh. The interior was a labyrinth of shadows, punctuated by the eerie glow of moonlight filtering through broken windows. Dust motes danced in the air, illuminated by the dim beams of my flashlight. The house was a maze of decaying grandeur. Ornate plasterwork, once white, was now a sickly gray. The floorboards were warped and cracked, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. With every step, I expected to hear the floor give way beneath me, plunging me into the darkness below. A sudden, sharp crack echoed through the house. My heart pounded in my chest as I spun around, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the gloom. Nothing, just the relentless creaking of the old house settling. Or was it something else? As I ventured deeper, the house seemed to close in around me. The walls seemed to press closer, and the shadows grew longer, more menacing. A cold draft swept through the house, chilling me to the bone. I pulled my jacket tighter, but it did little to ward off the icy chill. Then I heard it. A whisper, soft and ethereal, carried on the wind. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My skin prickled as the whisper grew louder, more insistent. It was a woman's voice, filled with a haunting sorrow. Fear gnawed at my insides as I stumbled through the darkness. Desperate to escape the house, the whisper followed me, growing louder with every step. And then I saw it, a figure standing at the end of the hallway. A woman, cloaked in shadow, her face hidden in darkness. Her eyes, two burning embers in the gloom, seemed to pierce through me. A scream built in my throat, but no sound escaped my lips. The woman raised a skeletal hand, and in that moment, I knew I was trapped. The world dissolved into chaos. The house seemed to shake. The floor beneath me buckled. The woman's laughter, a chilling, inhuman sound, echoed through the darkness. And then, silence. When my senses returned, I was lying on the cold, hard ground outside the house. The moon was still high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the desolate landscape. The house stood before me, unchanged, a silent sentinel of darkness. I crawled away, my body trembling, my mind a maelstrom of fear and confusion. As I looked back one last time, I saw a light flicker in one of the upper windows. A cold dread washed over me. I had escaped the house, but I knew I would never truly escape its shadow. The house was still there, waiting, its dark heart filled with secrets and horrors. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it would not be long before it claimed another victim. I never returned to that place. And to this day I can still hear the whisper, the haunting melody of a woman lost in darkness. The escape was a blur of adrenaline and terror. I stumbled through the night, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The house, a monstrous silhouette against the moonlit sky, seemed to loom larger with every step I took away from it. Days turned into a haze of sleepless nights and trembling hands. The whisper, that haunting echo of a woman's sorrow, was a constant companion. It was in the rustling of leaves, the creak of floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator. Paranoia gnawed at me, turning shadows into monsters and every unfamiliar sound into a threat. I sought help, of course. Doctors offered tranquilizers. Psychiatrists suggested therapy. But their words were empty against the tangible fear that gripped me. They couldn't see the terror in my eyes, the way my body would stiffen at the slightest noise. Then came the nightmares. They were more than dreams. They were vivid, suffocating relics of the house. I would be trapped again. The walls closing in, the woman's whisper, a chilling dirge. And then, the darkness, a void that promised eternal torment. I would wake drenched in sweat, my heart pounding like a trapped bird. People began to avoid me. My erratic behavior, the wild look in my eyes, was unsettling. Whispers followed me, dark tales of a man driven mad by a haunted house. I became a pariah, a ghost in my own life. One night, unable to bear the loneliness and terror any longer, I decided to confront my fear. I drove back to the house, the same dirt road stretching out before me like a serpent. The house was unchanged, a brooding, malevolent presence in the night. With a trembling hand, I opened the car door. The old fear washed over me, a cold wave of dread, but I was determined. I had to end this. The house was darker than I remembered, the shadows deeper, more menacing. The whisper was louder, more insistent. I moved through the house like a sleepwalker, my senses on high alert. Every creak, every groan was a jolt to my system. And then, in the heart of the house, I found her. A room untouched by time, filled with a strange, ethereal light. In the center of the room stood a woman, not a ghost, but a living, breathing woman. Her eyes were filled with a sadness that mirrored my own. She looked at me, a silent understanding passing between us. And then she spoke. Her voice was soft, but it carried a weight of centuries. "You are not alone," she said. "Many have come here, seeking answers, seeking escape, but the house is not a prison. It is a refuge, a place of healing." Her words were like a balm to my soul. The terror began to fade, replaced by a sense of peace. The house, I realized, was not a malevolent entity, but a wounded place, a repository of sorrow. I spent the night in the house, talking to the woman, learning her story. She was a woman out of time, a victim of circumstance, trapped in a house that was both a prison and a sanctuary. When morning came, I left the house, a different man. The fear was still there, but it was no longer a controlling force. I had faced my demons, and in doing so, I had found a measure of peace. The house on the hill still stands, a silent sentinel in the night, but for me it is no longer a place of terror. It is a reminder of strength, of the human spirit's ability to overcome even the darkest of fears. The whisper still echoes in my mind, but now it is a comforting lullaby, a reminder of the courage I found in the heart of darkness. The morning I left the house, a strange tranquility hung in the air. The woman, her name was Alara, had vanished, leaving behind an empty room and a lingering scent of jasmine. As I stepped out into the dawn, the house seemed to sigh, a mournful farewell. But the peace was deceptive. The world outside had shifted, grown darker, more menacing. Ordinary sounds, the wind, the creak of a tree, now carried an undercurrent of malice. Shadows seemed to lengthen and deepen, even in the brightest sunlight. People I'd known for years looked at me with a strange, knowing glint in their eyes. I tried to ignore it, to bury the growing unease. I found a job, a small apartment, and tried to rebuild my life. But the house was always there, a specter in my mind. And then, the whispers returned, louder, more insistent. They were no longer just in my head. Others heard them too. People began to disappear. At first, it was the homeless, the marginalized. But then, it was neighbors, friends, even children. The pattern was always the same. A disappearance, a whisper on the wind, and then, silence. The police were baffled. There were no clues, no bodies, just an eerie quiet that settled over the town. And then, one night, I saw it. A figure, cloaked in shadow, moving through the night. It was the same figure I'd seen in the house, Alara, but twisted, corrupted. Fear, cold and absolute, gripped me. I knew what was coming. I packed a bag, a few essentials, and left. I drove for days, until the familiar landmarks were replaced by endless stretches of highway. I found a remote cabin in the woods, a place where I hoped to hide. But even here, I was not safe. The whispers followed me, a persistent, maddening chorus. And then, one night, as I sat by the fire, I saw her, Alara, standing in the doorway, her eyes burning with an inhuman intensity. "You cannot escape," she said, her voice a chilling whisper. "We are everywhere." Terror seized me. I grabbed a shotgun, the only weapon I had, and fired. The blast echoed through the woods, but she was gone when I emerged from the smoke. Days turned into weeks. I lived in constant fear, a hunted animal. I lost track of time, of reality. The line between sanity and madness blurred. One night, as I lay awake, listening to the wind howl outside, I heard a different sound. A soft, mournful melody. The same melody I'd heard in the house. And then, a voice, a woman's voice, filled with a profound sorrow. "It is over," the voice said. "You are free." With these words, a sense of peace washed over me. The terror, the fear, it was all gone. I closed my eyes and slept, a deep, dreamless sleep. When I woke, the sun was shining. The world outside looked different, somehow cleansed. The whispers were gone. I don't know what happened that night. Perhaps it was a mass hallucination, a collective madness. Or perhaps something truly terrible had been defeated. Whatever the truth, I was free. I left the cabin, ready to face the world again. It was a new world, filled with uncertainty and fear, but also with hope. And as I walked into the sunrise, I carried with me the memory of the house, of Alara, and of the terrifying beauty of the human spirit. The house on the hill still stands, a silent sentinel in the night, but its power is broken. And as for me, I am a survivor, a ghost haunting the edges of a world that will never truly be the same.